Please come home now, the little girl whispered, her voice trembling so softly it seemed the entire mansion might break if it heard her. Before anyone could answer, the front door opened and Dante Moretti walked in, still wearing the cold precision of a man who controlled half the city and had no patience for anything that wasted his time. But the moment he heard those words, his pace slowed. His hand, mid-motion to loosen his tie, stopped at his throat. Inside the house, the light was warm and expensive, spilling over polished marble floors, crystal frames, and family portraits that smiled too cleanly for a home that had begun to feel like a battlefield of quiet fears. On the sofa sat Elena, the black maid who had worked in this house for nearly 2 years, her uniform neat, her posture steady, her expression calm in the way only deeply hurt people could manage. In her lap was Dante's daughter, Sophia, 5 years old and stubbornly clinging to Elena's sleeve as if it were the only safe thing left in the world. "I told you not to upset her," said Mrs. Moretti's sister from across the room, her tone sharp enough to cut glass without raising her voice. She stood near the fireplace with her arms folded, dressed in cream silk, her smile thin and practiced, the kind people used when they wanted to sound innocent while doing damage. "We were just trying to explain that some people shouldn't get too attached." Elena's eyes lifted, quiet but unshaken. "She was crying," she said. "That was all." Dante's gaze moved from the child to Elena, and for a brief second, the room seemed to lose its air. Sophia had red cheeks, damp lashes, and both hands wrapped around Elena's wrist. When she saw her father, she did not run to him. She tightened her grip on Elena instead. "Papa," she said in a small, broken voice, "don't send her away." The words landed harder than any accusation ever could. Dante had survived boardrooms, betrayals, and men who smiled while reaching for his throat, but nothing in his life had prepared him for the fear in his daughter's voice. He looked at Elena again, really looked at her this time, and noticed the details everyone else had chosen not to see. The fresh cup of milk beside the couch, the child-sized blanket folded carefully over Sophia's knees, the little stack of picture books placed within reach, the patience in Elena's hands as she gently smoothed Sophia's hair back from her face. Elena had not simply been watching the child. She had been holding her together. "What happened?" Dante asked, his voice low, controlled, almost dangerous in its calm. The room went still. Elena didn't flinch. She simply said, "She asked for her mother. I told her she was safe here until her heart stopped hurting." That was when Dante's expression changed. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Just enough for anyone paying attention to understand that something deep inside him had shifted. Sophia leaned into Elena's side, her small voice barely above a whisper. "She stays." And in that silent, expensive room, with every adult holding their breath, Dante Moretti realized this was not a warning from a child. It was a test of his heart. The silence after Sophia's words did not pass quickly. It settled over the room like a heavy curtain, thick enough to make even the ticking clock near the fireplace sound disrespectful. Elena stood near the couch with one hand resting lightly on the little girl's shoulder, calm and composed in the way only people who had weathered real sorrow could ever be. Dante did not move right away. He kept his eyes on Sophia, on the way she clung to Elena, as if letting go would break something fragile inside her. Then, slowly, his gaze shifted to the toys scattered neatly on the rug, to the blanket folded with care, to the untouched glass of water placed within Sophia's reach. Small things, quiet things, the kind of details most people never noticed, because they had never learned how much love could be hidden inside ordinary patience. "How long has she been like this?" he asked at last, his voice lower now, stripped of its usual steel. Elena did not rush to answer. "Since yesterday afternoon," she said. "She was fine after lunch, then she grew quiet. She kept asking if you were coming home early." Dante's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, not with anger, but with something far more dangerous to his own peace. Regret. He had spent years believing that showing up with money, security, and control was enough. He had built walls around this house, around his daughter, around himself. Yet one small child had managed to uncover the one weakness he never defended against. A child needed more than protection. She needed presence. Sophia rubbed her eyes and looked up at him with the exhausted trust of someone too young to understand why adults disappeared for long hours and returned smelling of cold air and unfinished business. You said you would come back, she whispered. The words were soft, but they struck him harder than anything spoken in a boardroom. Dante knelt slowly, bringing himself down to her level, and for the first time that night, he looked less like a powerful man and more like a father trying not to fail. I am here now, he said, not as an excuse, not as a promise he had already broken, just the truth, bare and quiet. Sophia studied his face as if searching for the answer to a question she did not yet know how to ask. Elena watched them both, her expression unreadable, though her hand never left the child's back. She had not stepped in to win favor. She had stepped in because the child had been hurting, and that kind of compassion could not be faked for long. Dante saw that now. He saw it in the way Elena kept her voice gentle without becoming weak, in the way she had created comfort out of almost nothing, in the way Sophia's breathing finally began to slow when she stood nearby. Did she eat anything? He asked. A few bites, Elena replied. Only after I sat with her. And you stayed with her the whole time? Elena nodded once. She did not want to be alone. Dante looked back at his daughter, and something in his expression softened in a way that made the entire room feel different. The ice was not gone, but it had cracked. You could have called me, he said quietly. Elena met his eyes without fear. I did not think she needed a command. I thought she needed a person. The answer lingered between them, simple and devastating. Even Dante had no immediate reply. Sophia's small fingers curled into the fabric of Elena's sleeve again, and the gesture decided everything before any adult could speak. In that moment, Dante understood what had been happening in his own house while he was away. It had not just been babysitting. It had been rescue in the gentlest form possible. He rose slowly, his attention still on Elena. Stay close to her tonight, he said at last. Elena blinked, unsure whether she had heard him correctly. Sir, if she asks for you, stay. The order was not cold. It was almost careful, and because of that, it meant more than any praise could have. Dante glanced toward the hallway, then back at his daughter, who had already begun to relax now that the storm inside her had quieted. She will not sleep well if she thinks she is being left again, Elena said. Dante nodded once, his silence heavier now, but no longer empty. He had come home expecting a report. Instead, he had walked into a mirror held up by a child and a woman he had nearly overlooked. And what he saw there was not power. It was responsibility. It was tenderness. It was the beginning of a change he had not planned for and could not easily turn away from. The next morning arrived with a pale wash of sunlight over the Moretti estate, turning the marble floors to silver and the long windows into mirrors. Elena had barely slept. She had spent most of the night outside Sophia's room, listening to the child's breathing settle and then catch again in restless little waves. When dawn finally touched the hallway, Sophia was already awake, sitting upright beneath her blanket with her stuffed rabbit in both arms and her eyes fixed on the door as if she expected the whole world to disappear the moment it opened. Elena crossed the room quietly and knelt beside her bed. You are safe, she said softly. Sophia studied her face for a long moment, then reached out and touched Elena's sleeve with hesitant fingers, as though confirming she was real. Downstairs, Dante stood in the dining room with a cup of black coffee untouched in his hand, his attention somewhere far beyond the glass walls and landscaped gardens. He had the look of a man used to controlling every room he entered, yet this morning there was something unsettled in him, something thoughtful and raw beneath the careful surface. When Elena entered with Sophia at her side, he lifted his eyes immediately. The little girl did not run to him. She stayed close to Elena, her hand still gripping the fabric at Elena's wrist. Dante noticed, and though it struck him, he did not show offense. Instead, he set the coffee down and crouched to Sophia's level, his voice quieter than it had been the night before. Good morning, sweetheart. Sophia looked at him, then at Elena, then back again. Is she staying? She asked. The question was so small, and yet it carried the entire weight of her world inside it. Dante went still for a beat. Elena answered before he could. I am here today. Sophia's shoulders loosened a little. Dante saw it happen, saw how the child's fear seemed to retreat only when Elena spoke. It was an honesty no report could have given him. It was not discipline that soothed Sophia. It was trust. At the table, while the morning light spread across the white linen and polished silverware, Dante watched Elena pour milk into Sophia's cereal with the patience of someone who understood that kindness was often made of ordinary things. No one in the house had ever done that with such gentleness. Not once did Elena rush her. Not once did she speak to her like a burden. And in that quiet routine, Dante began to see what had happened the day before with a different kind of clarity. His daughter had not been clinging to a stranger. She had been reaching for the first person who made the house feel less like a fortress and more like a home. Later, when Sophia was occupied with coloring at the kitchen table, Dante asked Elena to step into the sunroom. The room was warm with morning light, the scent of fresh coffee and polished wood hanging in the air. He stood by the window for a moment before speaking, his hands folded behind him, his profile severe and composed. "You were right to stay with her," he said. Elena said nothing, waiting. Dante turned toward her. "I want to understand something." His voice was low, careful now, as if he had learned that force did not belong in every conversation. "What does she need that I have not been giving her?" Elena's expression softened, but she did not answer quickly. She looked out toward the garden first, then back at him. "She needs someone who stays when the room gets quiet," she said. "She needs to know that love does not leave just because it is inconvenient." The words landed with a weight he could not ignore. For a moment, Dante did not move. Somewhere in the house, Sophia began humming to herself while she colored, a small, steady sound drifting through the open doorway like proof of life. Dante looked at Elena then, really looked at her, and for the first time he understood that her strength was not loud. It was steady. It did not demand attention. It simply held the things that were about to fall apart. And in that stillness, he felt something in himself begin to shift, not in grand gestures, but in the quieter place where real change always starts. By the time the afternoon light had softened over the Moretti estate, Elena had already learned that silence in a house like this was never empty. It watched. It listened. It measured every breath, every step, every pause between words. Sophia sat at the long dining table with a box of colored pencils spread before her, the bright paper in front of her lit by the pale gold drifting through the windows. She was drawing a house with too many windows and a garden full of flowers that looked almost too large for the page, as if she were building a world where everything gentle had room to stay. Dante stood near the doorway, one hand resting lightly against the polished frame, and for once he was not giving orders. He was watching. That alone changed the atmosphere. Elena noticed it immediately. He had the same controlled posture as always, the same expensive watch, the same steady presence that made other people lower their voices without meaning to. But there was something quieter in him now, something unsettled and unfamiliar, as if the child in the room had touched a place he had spent years keeping closed. "Do you like that color?" Sophia asked without looking up, holding out a pencil toward him. It was a simple question, but it landed in the room with unusual weight. Dante looked at the blue pencil in her small hand, and then at the drawing, at the crooked sky and the flowers reaching toward the roof. "I do," he said at last. Sophia nodded, satisfied, and returned to her picture as if she had just accepted an important answer. Elena lowered the cloth she had been folding and felt something in her chest ease, just a little. She had seen enough children to know when one was waiting for permission to exist. Sophia was not waiting now. She was beginning to feel safe enough to make her own world. Dante crossed the room slowly and stopped beside the table. "I spoke with Dr. Bennett this morning," he said, his voice calmer than it had been the day before. "She said the changes here have to be steady. No surprises. No sudden demands." Elena met his eyes and saw that he was not asking for control anymore. He was trying to learn. "That is true for most children," she said, "especially for one who has already been asked to adjust too much." Dante's jaw tightened briefly, but he did not argue. Instead, he glanced toward Sophia, who was now carefully coloring the roof of her little house. "I did not know," he said quietly. It was not much, but for him it was everything. Elena turned back to the table, giving him the dignity of saying it without making him beg for absolution. "Knowing is only the first step," she replied. "What matters is what you do after." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Somewhere upstairs, a door closed softly. Outside, the wind moved through the garden trees, brushing the windows with a sound like distant rain. Sophia held up her drawing and pointed to the tiny figure she had added near the front steps. "That is me," she said. Then she pointed to another shape beside the door. "And that is you." Her small finger moved again, this time to a taller figure standing by the path. And that is him. Elena looked at the picture and felt Dante go still beside her. On the page, the three of them stood in front of the house together, not perfectly placed, not polished, but present. It was the first time Sophia had drawn them as a family, even if she did not yet know that word. Dante stared at the page longer than he meant to. Something in his face changed, subtle and deep, like the quiet crack of ice giving way to water beneath. Elena saw it and said nothing. Some truths did not need to be explained out loud. They only needed time to settle. By the time evening settled over the Moretti estate, the house had grown quieter, but it was the kind of quiet that seemed to carry meaning. The chandeliers above the dining room glowed with a soft amber light, reflecting off the polished wood and the tall windows that showed the first shadows of night gathering across the garden. Elena stood near the sideboard with a folded cloth in her hands, her posture careful, her expression calm, as if she had learned long ago how to remain steady in rooms where other people held all the power. Dante noticed that now more than ever. He had spent years in rooms filled with men who spoke loudly and needed to prove themselves, but Elena's silence was different. It was not weakness. It was restraint. It was dignity. Sophia sat at the table, her small legs swinging beneath the chair, humming to herself while she worked on another drawing. She looked up when Elena came closer and held out a page covered in bright crayon lines. This one was a garden, full of yellow flowers and long green stems, with a little path leading toward a front door. In the center stood a small figure with a simple smile. "That is for you," Sophia said, her voice gentle and sure. Elena looked down at the drawing, and for a moment she did not speak. It was such a small thing, just paper and color in a child's hand, but in that house it felt larger than anything expensive money could buy. Dante watched the exchange from the far end of the room, his arms resting loosely at his sides, his expression unreadable at first. Then Sophia reached into the pocket of her cardigan and pulled out a tiny ribbon, faded pink and a little wrinkled from being carried around all day. She held it up toward Elena with both hands. "For your hair," she said. Elena blinked, caught off guard by the tenderness of it. "You do not have to do that, sweetheart." Sophia shook her head. "Yes, I do." The words were simple, but they landed with surprising weight. Elena bent slightly, letting the child tie the ribbon with clumsy concentration, her small fingers working carefully against the dark strands of Elena's hair. Dante felt something tighten in his chest as he watched. It was not the ribbon itself. It was the trust behind it. The child was not performing. She was choosing. And in a house where so many things were arranged, negotiated, and controlled, that choice felt like a quiet truth no one could ignore. When Sophia stepped back to admire her work, she smiled with clear satisfaction. "Now you look nice," she declared. Elena gave a soft laugh, the kind that came more from emotion than amusement. "Thank you, Sophia." Dante moved closer then, slow enough not to disturb the moment. He looked at Elena, then at the ribbon in her hair, and for one unguarded second, his face softened in a way that would have surprised anyone who knew him only from the outside. "She made a good decision," he said quietly. Sophia turned toward him, her eyes bright. "I know." The answer made Elena glance down, trying to hide the small smile that had appeared before she could stop it. Dante saw it anyway. He had begun to notice those small things about her, the way she stepped aside so others could pass, the way she listened before she spoke, the way she carried kindness as if it were something precious and not something to be wasted. It unsettled him more than he cared to admit, because it reminded him that strength did not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrived quietly, in a steady voice and a patient hand, and stayed long after everyone else had left. Sophia suddenly yawned and leaned against Elena's arm, her eyelids growing heavy. "Can Elena read to me tonight?" she asked, already half asleep. Dante looked at Elena, and there was a question in his eyes that did not need words. Elena nodded once. "Of course." Sophia smiled against the fabric of her sleeve, comfort already pulling her into sleep. Dante remained where he was for a moment longer, looking at the two of them under the warm light, and something in the room felt settled in a way it had not before. Not fixed, not finished, but settled, as if a piece that had been missing had quietly found its place. And for the first time in a long while, Dante Moretti did not feel like a man standing above his own life. He felt like a father watching something fragile and real begin to grow. The next morning, The Moretti estate woke beneath a soft wash of gray light, the kind that turned the windows pale and made every hallway feel even more still than usual. Elena had already been up for hours. She moved quietly through the kitchen with Sophia beside her, helping set out breakfast on the long table while the house slowly came alive around them. It was a small routine, but in a home like this, small routines mattered. They gave shape to the day. They gave a child something steady to hold on to. Sophia sat at the table in her pajamas, swinging her feet under the chair as she watched Elena butter toast and pour warm milk into a glass with careful hands. "You always make everything feel better," the little girl said, her voice soft and sincere. Elena paused for just a second, then smiled down at her. "Sometimes all people need is someone to stay calm," she replied. Across the room, Dante stood near the doorway with his coffee untouched in his hand, watching them in silence. He had intended to review messages before his first call of the day, but instead he found himself looking at the two of them the way a man looks at something fragile after nearly losing it. There was no performance in Elena's kindness, no effort to be noticed. She simply noticed what was needed and gave it without asking for anything in return. That, more than anything, unsettled him in the best possible way. "Did you sleep at all?" he asked her finally. Elena glanced up, then nodded. Enough. It was not a complete answer, but it was honest. Dante accepted that. He had learned, in the span of a single evening, that honesty from Elena rarely came wrapped in long explanations. It came in simple words and steady actions. Sophia finished her toast and wiped her hands on her napkin before reaching for Elena's sleeve. "Will you stay near me today?" she asked. The question was so direct, so open, that Elena had to look away for a moment before answering. "If your father allows it, yes." Dante's jaw tightened slightly at the way she said it, like her place in the house still had to be permitted, still had to be earned. He set his cup down and walked closer to the table. "You do not need my permission to be kind to my daughter," he said. Elena met his eyes then, calm and unreadable. "I know that," she replied. "But I also know this is your home." The answer struck him harder than he expected, because it was neither defensive nor submissive. It was respectful, clear, dignified. Before he could answer, the sound of a car arriving outside pulled his attention toward the front of the house. A moment later, one of his men appeared in the doorway with a guarded expression and a sealed envelope in his hand. "Mr. Moretti," he said quietly, "this came for you from the family office." Dante took the envelope, feeling the thick paper between his fingers. Something in the room changed at once, not loudly, but enough for Elena to notice. She saw the way his shoulders stiffened. She saw the way his eyes narrowed as he broke the seal. Sophia sensed it too and went still in her chair. Dante read the first line, and the color in his face changed so subtly that only someone watching carefully would have caught it. Elena watched carefully. "What is it?" she asked, not intruding, only concerned. Dante folded the letter halfway closed and held it a little too firmly. "A meeting," he said, but Elena could tell at once that it was more than that. The way he looked toward the window said the day had already shifted around some event she could not yet see. He stood there for a long moment, silent, weighing something inwardly while the house waited with him. Then he looked back at Sophia, then at Elena, and the decision in his face was not the one he had expected to make when he woke up that morning. It was quieter than that. He was not thinking like a man who wanted control. He was thinking like a father who understood what could be protected and what could not be ignored. And as Elena gathered Sophia's plate and set it aside, she felt the air in the room grow tense with the kind of uncertainty that always arrived before the truth. Dante's voice, when it came, was measured and low. "Finish breakfast," he said. "Then I need both of you to stay close." Elena looked at him for a beat longer than usual, searching his expression for what had changed, but he had already turned toward the hall, the envelope held in one hand like a warning he was not yet ready to explain. Sophia reached for Elena's fingers under the table, and Elena let her take them. In that small, quiet gesture, something unspoken passed between them. The house was no longer just a place of rules and distance. It was becoming a place where choices mattered. And somewhere beyond the marble walls, the day was beginning to move towards something neither of them could see yet, but both of them would soon have to face. The envelope had been opened in silence, but the silence itself had not broken the way Dante expected. It lingered in the air of the study, heavy and watchful, as if the room understood that some truths could not be rushed. Elena stood near the window with Sophia tucked close at her side, one hand resting lightly on the child's shoulder. She had not tried to speak first. She only waited, and in that waiting there was a kind of courage Dante had not seen in years. On the desk between them lay the contents of the envelope, neat and undeniable, the kind of evidence that did not shout because it did not need to. Dante read every line twice, then a third time, his expression changing by degrees so small they might have been missed by anyone who did not know him well. His jaw tightened. His eyes moved once towards Sophia, then back to the page. The truth was not dramatic in the way threats were dramatic. It was worse than that. It was patient. It had lived quietly beside him, hidden in plain sight, and now it had finally stepped into the light. Elena saw the moment it landed. She had come to expect anger from powerful men. She had come to brace for blame, for denial, for the cold kind of disbelief that often followed bad news. But Dante did none of those things. He set the page down with care, as if even folded paper could carry weight, and leaned back in his chair. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he looked at Sophia again, and something in his face softened in a way that made Elena catch her breath. It was not pity. It was recognition. The kind that arrives when a man realizes the person he has been searching for was never far away, only waiting to be seen correctly. Sophia, sensing the change in the room, slid her hand into Elena's and asked in a small voice if they were in trouble. Elena bent slightly and kissed the top of her head before answering. "No, sweetheart," she said softly. "Not anymore." Dante rose from behind the desk and walked to the window, one hand resting on the back of a leather chair as he looked out across the estate. The late afternoon light had turned the grounds gold, but there was nothing warm in his silence. It was the silence of a man arranging his thoughts with precision. When he turned back, his voice was low and measured. "You should have told me sooner." Elena did not flinch. "And if I had," she asked quietly, "would you have believed me?" The question settled between them without cruelty, only truth. Dante did not answer right away. That was answer enough. He looked down at the child, then at Elena, and the old authority in his posture seemed to shift into something more human, more burdened, more real. "No one is taking her from this house," he said at last. The words were not loud, but they carried. Sophia looked up at him, uncertain, while Elena remained still, reading the room the way people learn to read weather before a storm. But this was not a storm. It was a decision. And once Dante Moretti made a decision, the entire house felt it. Somewhere beyond the study door, footsteps moved through the hallway, and a distant voice called his name, but he did not turn. His attention remained fixed on the two people in front of him, on the fragile thread that had just become stronger than fear. Elena had expected consequences. What she had not expected was protection. And in that quiet, startling shift, the balance of the house began to change. The morning after Dante made his choice, the Moretti estate moved differently, as if the walls themselves had begun to understand that something had shifted for good. Elena rose before the sun had fully lifted above the trees, finding Sophia already awake and sitting quietly by the window with her knees drawn close, the child's small face turned toward the pale light. There was no fear in her now, only the cautious stillness of someone waiting to see whether safety would remain after the first promise was spoken. Elena crossed the room softly and brushed a strand of hair from Sophia's cheek. "You slept better," she said, and Sophia gave the smallest nod, as if she did not yet trust happiness enough to name it. Downstairs, the house staff moved with unusual restraint. Even the footfalls in the hallway seemed softer, the clink of dishes quieter, the entire rhythm of the estate careful not to disturb the fragile calm that had taken root overnight. Dante had already been in his study for more than an hour, phone calls moving in and out around him, his voice measured, controlled, and unmistakably final. He was not speaking like a man asking permission anymore. He was speaking like a father who had seen the truth and could not unsee it. When Elena entered the study, he looked up from the papers on his desk. The morning light fell across one side of his face, leaving the other in shadow, and for a moment he appeared exactly as he always had, built of discipline and distance. But the distance was no longer complete. "There will be new arrangements," he said, setting the folder aside. "Sophia is not leaving this house, and no one is to speak to her as if she does not belong here." Elena stood still, her hands folded loosely before her. She had expected a decree. What she heard instead was certainty without cruelty. People will talk, she said quietly. Let them, Dante replied. His tone was calm, but there was a force behind it that made the room feel smaller. They have been talking for years. That is not the same thing as being right. Elena lowered her eyes, not because she had been shamed, but because the weight of being believed was heavier than she had expected. For so long, she had been forced to defend what was true. Now she was standing in front of a man who had decided the truth did not need defending anymore. Sophia appeared in the doorway a moment later, holding her stuffed rabbit by one ear. She did not enter all the way at first. She only watched them with the careful expression of a child trying to understand whether the adults in the room were still the same people they had been yesterday. Dante saw her and softened without effort. Come here, Sophia. The little girl stepped forward slowly, and when he crouched to her level, the movement itself seemed to surprise her. He was not towering now. He was listening. This is your home, he said. No one will make you feel otherwise. Sophia looked at him for a long second, then glanced back at Elena as if asking permission to believe him. Elena gave a faint nod, and that was enough. The child moved into Dante's space with hesitant trust, then settled beside him as though something inside her had finally stopped bracing for impact. The sight changed the air in the study. It was not dramatic. It was quieter than that, more lasting. Dante glanced toward the window, toward the grounds beyond the glass, where the estate spread out in stillness under the growing daylight. I will handle the legal matter today, he said, and I want a family meeting this evening. No interruptions. Elena understood what he was not saying. He was not only protecting Sophia from the outside world. He was preparing to face the truth inside his own house, the kind that settled into bloodlines and old loyalties and was often called tradition when it was really fear. She said nothing because some moments did not require argument. They required witness. Across the room, Sophia leaned lightly against his side, and Dante, after the briefest pause, rested one hand on her back with a gentleness that would have seemed impossible to anyone who had known him before. Elena watched the gesture and felt something inside her loosen. A tension she had carried so long, she had almost mistaken it for life. The room stayed quiet, but it was no longer the quiet of uncertainty. It was the quiet that comes before a house begins to heal. And in that stillness, Dante Moretti understood something he had never learned from power, money, or fear. A home was not built by control. It was built by who you chose to protect when the truth finally arrived. By the time the last light of afternoon settled across the Moretti estate, the house no longer felt like a place holding its breath. It felt lived in, not healed, not yet, but softened in places that had once been hard with silence. In the wide nursery, Sophia sat on the rug with a small row of wooden animals in front of her, arranging them with careful concentration while Elena folded tiny clothes at the edge of the room. Dante stood in the doorway for a moment longer than necessary, watching the two of them in the warm gold drifting through the windows, and something in his chest tightened with a kind of quiet that frightened him more than anger ever had. There were meetings waiting for him downstairs, calls from men who still expected him to be the same person he had always been, and decisions that belonged to a world built on fear and control. But none of it felt larger than this room. None of it felt louder than the soft scrape of Sophia moving a toy across the floor. Elena looked up and saw him there. She did not smile in a way that demanded anything from him. She simply met his eyes, steady and unafraid, as if she had learned that silence could be a form of trust when the right people were in it. Dante stepped inside and lowered himself into the chair near the window, one hand resting loosely against his knee, his posture still carrying the habit of command even when he did not mean to. Sophia noticed him at once and lifted one of the animals toward him. For you, she said in her small, careful voice. It was a wooden lion, painted in bright, imperfect strokes. Dante took it as though it were something far more fragile than wood. His fingers closed around it slowly, and for a moment he could not speak. Elena watched him with an expression that held no triumph, only a kind of patient recognition. She had seen enough people hide behind power to know how rare it was when it began to fall away. He looked from the toy in his hand to Sophia, then to Elena, and the realization came to him with almost painful clarity. Protection was not enough. Provision was not enough. A house could be guarded, and still remain empty. A family could be safe and still never feel like one. He had spent years believing that control was the closest thing to love a man like him could offer. But in this room, with the sunlight turning the dust in the air to gold, he understood how wrong that had been. "Sophia," he said quietly, and the little girl turned toward him with complete attention. "Would you like to help me choose where this goes?" He held up the lion, and she nodded with serious delight, already climbing to her feet. The simple moment carried a weight deeper than any oath. Elena saw it as clearly as he did. This was not a performance. It was not pity. It was the beginning of belonging. Later, after Sophia had fallen asleep and the halls had grown still again, Dante stood alone near the darkened nursery window, the lion still resting on the shelf where Sophia had placed it. The estate beyond the glass looked different now, not because its walls had changed, but because he had. He thought of the choices that had brought them here, of every cold instinct that had once ruled him, and of the woman whose courage had forced him to see what he had nearly lost before it was gone. He did not turn when Elena entered. He knew it was her by the softness of her footsteps, by the way the room seemed to settle when she was near. She stopped beside him, both of them facing the glass. "She is sleeping peacefully," Elena said. Dante nodded once. "Because she is not afraid here anymore." The words landed between them gently, but they stayed. He looked at her then, and for the first time, there was no armor in his face. Only understanding, only gratitude, only the sober knowledge that some homes were not inherited. They were built, one honest choice at a time. And in the quiet that followed, with the child safe in the next room and the woman who had changed everything standing beside him, Dante Moretti finally understood that the life he had thought was strength had only been a cage. What he was choosing now was something far harder, something quieter, something real.